My name's Doug Bowie, and I'll be working with you today on basic workstation and network diagnostic tools. Perhaps the most basic of all of our configuration tools that we can use is to understand what the settings of our local computer are. And different operating systems have different ways of doing that, and in fact, operating systems can have multiple ways of doing that with different tools. So I'm going to cover a couple of the basics, ones we might see in labs or classes or other places. And in Windows, there's one that comes installed already, ipconfig/all, comes on all versions of Windows. It's kind of the standard command line way of looking at what all your Ethernet card settings are. Hardware addresses, IP addresses, subnet masks, DNS entries, all that kind of stuff. Kind of comes all in ipconfig. It'll list every single Ethernet card in the machine and show it all to you. And it makes it, kind of nice to have it all in one spot. In Linux, it comes in a couple of different tools. The primary one that's in most versions of Linux today is IP-A, which will show you all the address information. So it'll give you its MAC address and its IP address and probably its subnet mask, and we'll see some of that kind of stuff in the demo. It may not, depending on what it's allowed to show, it may not show DNS entries. There may be other tools that you have to use to do that, and it will just depend. A third option that we use in labs and is nmcli. NM stands for Network Manager, which is a different way to manage Ethernet cards. It's quite popular in, say, Ubuntu Desktop. It uses Network Manager. We use it in labs and have used it on our server infrastructure as well. So you can type nmcli and hit enter, and you'll see kind of all the same stuff you'd see in ipconfig/all. IP addresses, MAC addresses, DNS servers, that kind of stuff. It's one of the reasons we use it, because you can get it all in one place. Other commands of note, ipconfig is still around. It doesn't come standard on operating system, modern Linux operating systems, but you will definitely see it. It's installable if it's needed for a script or something like that. Ipconfig is very similar to IPA, but it's not a standard package, at least not in most Debian kernels, which is what we're using in class. But like I said, it is possible to install it, so it's possible to get it if you need it. Netstat is another command that we'll talk a little more about later in another video, and it tends to show us our DNS settings, so if you need that kind of stuff, like I said, nmcli shows it all to us. IPA only shows us the IP and the addresses that go with it. Netstat will show us some of our DNS settings. That tends to be the other half of the settings that we're looking for. We'll go on into a demo where I'll go through some of the different commands, showing them off and showing the output and kind of going through the output. All right, well, next up, we're going to run some command line options that are going to tell us and interrogate the machine for its settings. So what's my IP address? What's my network mask? What is the information that the machine knows about itself and can tell us? So different operating systems will have different ways. Windows has its way. Linux has its way. There are other, most pieces of equipment that are IP-based will have some way to get this information out of them so that you can identify what they are. And in Linux, there are two ways. There is IPA, which will spit out, this is local loopback, right? This is first Ethernet card. It has one, so it can basically talk to itself. And it should always have this IP address. 127.0.0.1 refers to yourself. That is you talking to you. Sounds odd. I'm not a computer programmer, but every single machine has a local loopback adapter, and there are all sorts of good reasons it will need that, and I am not going to go into them. The second one down here you can see is ENS33. And in Linux, these can change. These monikers can change depending on what hardware is installed in them. So are they Intel Ethernet cards or Netgear Ethernet cards? But IPA will tell you what the Ethernet card is called inside itself. Sometimes different flavors of Linux will call them ETH0 or ETH1, and the monikers won't change. It depends on the operating system and how it's been set up and configured. You can see here I highlighted its IP address, 10.101.1.97, and the slash notation next to it, /16, is its subnet mask. And there'll be lots of videos on what's a subnet mask and how does it work and that kind of stuff. And we're not going to go into that here, but that is how you would find a subnet mask using IPA. Its broadcast address here is next to it. And if you know anything about subnet masks, then the broadcast address will make sense as to what it is. We can also find things like its hardware address, its MAC address. Unfortunately, that term MAC gets used several different ways. But a MAC address, that number is physically burned into the Ethernet card. It is the physical uniqueness of an Ethernet card. They're done in hexadecimal, they're quite long. Manufacturers get issued big long lists of them to put in their equipment, but anything that has an Ethernet card, wireless, wired, will have a MAC address. And that's how we, later we'll talk about tools where we glue the physical world of this MAC address to the virtual world of an IP address. IP addresses can move to different pieces of equipment, but MAC addresses are pretty much permanent. There are ways to play head games with that. That's not always true, but in a normal operation of a normal network in the world, a MAC address is a physical characteristic of an Ethernet card and does not often change. All right, so this was IP-A. The other way to look at this is ipconfig, which I didn't install, so I will install it quickly. And install NetTools. We don't use this tool as much anymore, but you can find it on older hardware, and it's still pretty useful. So there we go, ipconfig. And it's going to spit out basically the same information, right? ENS33, we saw that up earlier. It's going to spit out its IP address. Its network mask is in a different format, but it's the same thing. If you'll recall, this is a /16, so 255 in binary would be 8 ones and 8 ones, so that's where the /16 would come from. Broadcast address would be here. In this case, we'll see its hardware address is also listed, and we get some different information. So ipconfig sort of spits out slightly different information. We also see local loopback. Again, there's no physical to a local loopback because it's a software construct, but it's still effectively the same thing as it was in IPA. It's still loopback. They're the same ways of looking at, they're different ways, sorry, of looking at the same hardware. All right, let me flip over to Windows, and we'll look at its version of this, which is called ipconfig. And if you do ipconfig, you'll get the summary version of all the Ethernet cards, and that won't show you everything. Oftentimes we're looking for information that's a little deeper, so we put a /all on it, which will show us all of the information about each Ethernet card. So, and it can spit out, depending on how many Ethernet cards you have, it can spit out a lot of information. So it'll start at the top with just basic, what does it know about the machine, you know, what's its DNS suffix and things like that. But as we come down in here, you can see it's got, this is the name of the Ethernet card. If you went and looked at the list of Ethernet cards in the machine, you'll find one called Ethernet 0. In Windows, it is renamable to something else. But you'll come down here and you'll find it's got its IP address, it's got a subnet mask, it's got some variety of other information that we'll get into, and its default gateway, things that we might get later out of netstat. Some of that in Windows we can get here out of ipconfig. You'll notice it's got DNS servers listed. We didn't see any of that in Ubuntu. There are ways to get that out of Linux. Windows kind of puts it all in one place, but there are different tools. Netstat does a ton of this kind of stuff in the Linux world, and you can do it in Windows too. But you'll see there's hardware address also listed in here for its hardware address. You'll notice that the Bluetooth adapter is listed, and it has a hardware address. Yes, and if you've ever done those kind of things with your Android or iPhone, you can transfer files via Bluetooth. And that's why it shows up as an Ethernet card. You can do the same thing in Windows or Linux. You can use them as short-range, local, physically close kind of Ethernet cards, and that's why they'll show up. We'll also see some of that depending on what version of Wireshark, like what it's running on. You may see it as an Ethernet device in Wireshark later. All right, so what we're going to see next is nmcli, which we use very often in our lab environment. It's a pretty typical network manager in our lab environment. It's standard. It's the network management tool standard in Ubuntu desktop. We have installed it on our lab machine server instances to make one tool across all of it, but it will do all the same kind of things that IPA would do, but it lets the student use one tool to do it. So that's why we wind up doing that. So you'll see nmcli, and I click on enter, and it's just going to show me all the standard kind of stuff. Same stuff you'd see in IPA, right? We're going to see Ethernet card addresses. We're going to see all the different IP addresses that it's got. Down at the bottom, we do get to see the DNS server, which is really quite nice in that, and you can see all of its IP addresses that it gets through here and that kind of thing. IPA doesn't show DNS servers. It's one of the reasons we liked nmcli. Works pretty well. Hope you've enjoyed the demo.